will take place on Saturday, the 9th. I'd like to thank Susan Angelastro for her sponsorship of tonight's lecture.
Thank you.
And thank Jason also for making time this evening. I know many of you are familiar with Jason's work. We benefit from his contributions to our medieval, Renaissance, and Grand Tour programs in the History of Art department. He's here tonight to speak about the intense rivalry between Filippo Brunelleschi and Lorenzo Ghiberti. Without further ado, I will let Jason present this wonderful talk and look forward to mediating the questions and answers at the end. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Thank you, Gary. And can everyone hear me all right? This is coming through? Okay, great. And thank you very much for giving us such a full house. Obviously, the word didn't get out that I'm a last-minute replacement. I appreciate that and I've benefited from that. So let's get right into it. So, yes, so Jeremy mentioned this intense competition between these two great artists. And it's one of the most famous instances of a competition between artists, happening, of course, right here in Florence at the beginning of the Renaissance. In fact, art historians generally will sort of pin the start of the early Renaissance in sculpture to the date of this competition in 1401. And the competition was held to decide which sculptor should receive Florence's biggest, most prestigious, most expensive sculptural commission in half a century. And that, of course, is the second set of bronze doors for the Florentine baptistry. Now, I should begin by mentioning just why doors are so important in the first place. Why would a set of doors be the most significant sculpture in Florence in 1401? Why spend fortunes and years in the construction of bronze doors? So doors merit this significance for a few reasons. First off, and this shouldn't be overlooked, is that Pisa had a set of bronze doors. And they were done for the cathedral around the year 1180 by a man named Bonanno da Pisa. And these bronze doors were justly famous and one of the largest bronze objects created since antiquity up to that point in Italy. And any Florentine then, as well as now, will tell you that Florence is superior to Pisa in all ways. Therefore, Florence shall have bronze doors, and they will be superior to Pisa's. It goes without saying, right? Now, Bonanno da Pisa created these doors with late Romanesque reliefs, which, you know, it fits their time period, 1180, remember, fairly early on. Overall, the theme of the relief panels are it's the theme of the life of Christ. It's the narrative of the life of Christ. And here we see the presentation at the temple, and then the flight from Egypt, and the visitation, the Annunciation, and then the visitation. Romanesque sculpture is quite often charming. It's one of its greatest aesthetic attributes is its charm, and I think these panels demonstrate that quite well. Now, aside from rivalry with Pisa, the doors of a cathedral, and by extension, the doors of a cathedral's baptistry, have a very powerful significance. So one symbolic aspect of doors, of course, is a person's relation to them. What side of the door are you on? Are you in or are you out? And this is a very pertinent question to ask oneself when standing in front of a baptistry. A baptistry, after all, it's where souls receive the salvation of Christianity through baptism. So baptism is itself the doorway to heaven, and in fact is commonly referred to as such in Christian doctrine. And in medieval Florence, before individual baptisms became the norm, baptisms were only performed a few times a year, usually on Holy Saturday and on Pentecost. And the Florence Baptistry actually used to have 5 baptismal fonts to sort of handle the demand on those days, just these big mass baptisms. And on most other days, the baptistry would be tightly locked so as to prevent anyone from coming in and performing a non-sanctioned baptism and thus gaining access to heaven through illicit means. So baptistry doors were important and significant. Andrea Pisano, a metalsmith from Pontedera, just down the river, he was appointed to make a set of bronze doors for the baptistry in 1330, around 1330. The baptistry, of course, you know, has, or maybe you don't, has 3 portals. It's an 8-sided structure with 3 doors, the north, on the south, and on the east facing the cathedral. And Andrea Pisano's doors were placed on the south wall, where well, basically that was the most prominent set of doors of the baptistry at the time in the 1330s. Nowadays, the Duomo and the baptistry, that's right in the center of town, right? It's the heart of the city. But when the Duomo was being built 700 years ago, that was basically on the north end of town. Everything beyond that was suburban. And so the southern facing doors of the baptistry would have been the most visible and most prominent to the town south of that, right? The east facing doors, the ones facing the cathedral, they weren't facing a cathedral in 1330. They were facing a construction site, right? The rebuilding of Santa Reparata into Santa Maria del Fiore had only begun less than 4 decades before. So Andrea Pisano had created his first set of doors with the life of John the Baptist in a series of chronological scenes. And we actually think he had a lot of help with the design of the reliefs from the architect of the Duomo at that time, who at that time was none other than Giotto di Bandone, Giotto himself. The reliefs, in fact, are so Giotto-esque. There's a good chance that Andrea Pisano was merely the instrument of Giotto's designs, that Giotto, gave the designs to Andrea to just translate into relief. And his pictorial sensibilities, Giotto's pictorial sensibilities, modeled into bronze, basically made these doors the most artistically, if I could use this word, advanced, as well as the most expensive and most prominent sculpture in Florence at the time of its creation. And that's a status which persisted for the rest of the century, thanks to the disruption of the plague just a few decades on in 1349, right up until the end of the century. But once the Duomo was largely completed, the most prominent doors of the baptistry would no longer be those south doors, they'd be the ones facing the east. And so as the dawn of the 15th century approached, the need arose to commission a sculptor for this important second set of doors. Whoa, went too far. Sorry. There we go. We're good? All right. And so it came to pass that the powerful guild of the cloth importers and cloth finishers, known as the Arte di Calamala, saw fit to fund the construction of these doors. The most powerful guilds in Florence were the seats of political power as well as economic power, and so various civic building projects fell under the supervision of various guilds. Now, the Arte di Calamala had been refurbishing the baptistry for over a century, and so the sponsoring of the doors fell to them. Plans for a second set of doors actually began pretty much as soon as the first set of doors were completed in the late 1330s. And the Arte di Calamala had actually purchased a bunch of bronze in preparation for that second set of doors. But it wasn't until the 1390s that plans for the second set really started to progress. And again, we can blame largely the plague, the Black Death. Now, in this picture, we can see the stemma of the Arte di Calamala. Shows an eagle clutching a bundle of cloth in its talons. And today we can actually find the same stemma, the same eagle design on the baptistry itself above. This is what we're looking at are the north doors. And if you look all the way up to the top of the arch, we'll find the stemma of the Arte di Calamala there. What does the word Calimala mean? It's a strange word. It doesn't mean cloth finishers and importers. No one actually really knows for sure, but it is almost probable, quite possible, indeed, that it's an evolution of a Latin phrase, calis mala, which means bad road. So back in the day, all the cloth importers and finishers were clustered onto the Via Calimala, which apparently was not a very good road. And so the guild actually takes its name from the street rather than the other way around. So a little bit of trivia for you. Now, there was a bit of a hitch in commissioning this second set of doors in the year 1400. And it was this, there just wasn't a single, excuse me, there wasn't a single outstanding goldsmith in Florence to whom the commission should naturally fall. There were several competent ones, but no one whose work really invited natural comparison to the artistry of Andrea Pisano. And so it was decided that a competition should be held to choose the most competent goldsmith. Now, the Arte di Calamala opened the competition to everyone or not everyone, but anyone in Italy, not just Florence. And to make the judgment as fair as possible, it was going to be decided by vote by a huge committee of experts and interested parties, 34 people in all on this committee. It sounds like an absolute nightmare. And each contestant was to be given the use of materials with which they were to create in finished bronze a single panel for the doors, done basically the same dimensions and in the same style of Andrea Pisano's first set of doors, imitating the distinctive quatrefoil frame. And the contestants had 1 year in which to complete their panel. Now, the general theme for the second set of doors was to be taken from the Old Testament. And the committee thought, well, if they required the goldsmiths to create one of the scenes from this proposed set of doors, then when the contest was over, the winning panel just go right on the door, and that's going to save a little bit of time. And so the contestants were given the subject of the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham. Now, we don't know how the contestants were initially selected, but it came down eventually to 6 contestants. We got Simone da Colle, Francesco da Valdembrino, Niccolo Lamberti, Jacopo della Quercia, Filippo da Ser Brunellesco, and Lorenzo Bartoluccio, also known as Lorenzo Ghiberti. And this group of artists is notable in a few ways. First of all, they were all young. The oldest competitor was probably Jacopo della Quercia, and he was about 40 years old at the time. The youngest, Lorenzo Ghiberti, he was somewhere between 20 and 23 years old. His birth date is a little uncertain, but that's pretty young. And then you've got Filippo Brunelleschi, who was only a year or so older than Ghiberti, so in their early 20s. The other competitors were in their later 20s or perhaps 30. Now, what can explain this sort of across-the-board youth? Was it just that there were no goldsmiths of an older generation competent, to take on such a project? Or was there perhaps a deliberate age limit as a safeguard against the winner dying before this huge years and years long commission would be finished? We don't know. We don't actually know, but we can speculate. My money, for what it's worth, is probably on conditions created by the plague 50 years before. The disruption of the Black Death, it really can't be overstated, because not only would it have killed a lot of goldsmiths, just like everybody else, but demand for luxury items after the plague would have plummeted. And young people looking for a trade in the following decades may not have decided to choose to become a goldsmith at such a time. And the fact that the Arte di Calamala opened the competition to those outside of Florence and all over Italy kind of supports this notion of just not enough people, locally. And indeed, actually, out of the 6 competitors, only Brunelleschi and Ghiberti were native Florentines. And beyond that, it gets worse. Out of the 6 competitors, only 2 were even goldsmiths. Brunelleschi was a very young, fresh member of the Goldsmiths Guild, but at that time, not even a master. And Simone da Colle, a person we don't really know that much about, he probably had the most experience in casting metals, and he would later become known as a cannon founder. And it's so strange to hear how the committee, overseeing the most significant commission in decades in Florence, apparently had to scrape the bottom of the barrel to find even tangentially related artists. The other 4 competitors, out of the 4 remaining contestants, 3 were wood and stone carvers, not goldsmiths. And carvers generally do not or did not practice the arts of foundry work. They might be able to model a figure, but casting is a complex, involved, highly skilled process. So carvers would be at a distinct disadvantage. And so that's 3 out of the 4. And then the final remaining contestant was Lorenzo Ghiberti, who at some point was apprenticed in some informal way to his stepfather, who was indeed a goldsmith. But what little actual work experience Lorenzo Ghiberti had was actually as a painter. And he was at this time not affiliated with any guild at all. So good luck, guys. And so the contest is underway. At the end of the year, the works are presented for judgment to this enormous committee appointed by the Arte di Calamala. And by all accounts, Brunelleschi and Ghiberti stood out among the others. It seems from documentary clues that the other four were eliminated fairly early on. And evidence of this is the fact that out of the 6 competition panels, only 2 survive, those of Ghiberti and Brunelleschi. It is presumed that the other 4 were melted back down, as the materials would have been the property of the Arte di Calamala, and they would have been recycled for the fabrication of the door. It's a bit of a miracle, actually, I think, that both competition panels from Ghiberti and Brunelleschi survive unscathed to this day. And so who won? Don't say it out loud, please. Don't say it out loud. Well, okay, it'll come as no surprise. Ghiberti won. Everyone knows that, right? Ghiberti is as famous for his baptistry doors as Brunelleschi is for the cupola of the Duomo. But now all that remains is to finally take a look for ourselves at these 2 surviving competition panels and recognize the genius and talent in both of them and decide for ourselves who really did best, whether the panel of judges of the Arte di Calamala made the right decision. Now, it's no secret that Ghiberti won, but we may as well have a little fun and keep the authorship of the panels we're about to look at anonymous as we discuss them. So if you know who sculpted what, keep it to yourself for a few minutes so that those who are new to these panels can judge the merits for themselves and not be biased. So here they are. Now, as I mentioned, the competition stipulated that the competitors all render the same theme, that of the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham. It's a story from the Old Testament when God decides to test the faith of his servant Abraham by commanding Abraham to offer his only son as a human sacrifice. And Abraham isn't too crazy about the idea, but prepares to do it anyway. And just as Abraham raises his knife to slay his son, God sends an angel to stop him and spare the life of Isaac. Now, we don't have the documents that contained the rules specifically for the competition, so we can't know for sure, but it seems as though the committee didn't stop at merely dictating the theme. There are too many similarities in the content of these 2 surviving panels to be accidental. For instance, each panel has an Abraham, an Isaac, and an angel representing the most dramatic moment of the story, which is quite naturally, when the angel comes and spares the life of Isaac. But additionally, each panel also has 2 shepherds, 1 donkey, and the ram, which Abraham sacrifices eventually instead of his son. And it would make a lot of sense to have the competitors include all of these elements, because if you're going to judge the art of one artist against another, the most objective way to do this, it would seem, would be to have them address as nearly as possible identical content. And that way judgment could then focus on composition and rendering of these identical elements. So let's take a look at the first panel. Now, in this panel, contestant number 1, we see in the center the kneeling figure of Abraham's son, Isaac, atop a small altar under which a fire has been lit. Isaac is twisting and writhing under his father's grasp. And to his right, the aggressive figure of Abraham, with his robes sort of fluttering up behind him, lunges towards his son, one hand around the poor boy's throat and the other holding a knife to his neck. And at the left of the scene, an angel comes swooping in from the heavens and grabs the wrist of Abraham, staying the execution at the last possible instant. It's all very dramatic. And all this takes place in the sort of top 2/3 of the panel, while the lower third is composed rather originally as a bit of a foreground to the scene above, right? So even though the sacrifice is the center of the panel, it plays out in a space that is in the relative middle ground, which provides a sense of pictorial depth to the scene. And adding to this sense of space is a small craggy mountain as a background, sort of behind the fluttering drapery of Abraham, very much in the style of Andrea Pisano and by extension by Giotto, this sort of Giotto-esque sort of improbable looking craggy little mountain in the background. But let's turn our attention to the foreground. What's going on there? So the bottom third of the panel is really where we see, well, it's where we see the 2 shepherds and the donkey, and it's here where this competitor number 1, had a chance to really show off his modeling ability and his education. So to keep the figures low, he's got the donkey with his head bowed, drinking from a stream. One shepherd to his right, the donkey's right, is bent over. No, our right of the donkey is bent over, and he's using a shell. He's scooping up water out of the same stream to give himself a drink, right? Meanwhile, the second shepherd on our left sits and picks a thorn out of his foot. Above and beyond the shepherd, and my apologies, it's a little bit cropped, but above the thorn picking shepherd, we've got the ram. He's up there. We'll see it in the next picture how he's scratching his ear with his hind leg in a very naturalistic sort of gesture. And each element here, the shepherds, the ram, the donkey, they're being used to highlight various aspects of the sculptor's skill. Now, the shepherd with the shell on our right, in particular, is very notable. It's one of the most complex figure poses rendered in bronze at the time. It's tiny, but it's still, it's a real tour de force. He's seated, he's leaning forward very low enough where we, in front of him, can actually see his upper back. This figure has nothing to do with the Gothic tradition in style or pose or proportion. It's just simply well observed and well modeled. And it must have been done, in some way from life, whether from drawings or if he had a model posing. Nothing that Andrea Pisano or anyone in Tuscany had sculpted comes close to this level of complexity and naturalism, both at a very, very high level. And then we have the second shepherd, the one picking the thorn out of his foot. Now, with this figure, the sculptor is showing off his knowledge of the antique, because this figure is a close variation of a famous Roman bronze statue called Spinario, or sometimes referred to as the thorn picker, or boy with a thorn. This sculpture was a known work in public view in Rome. And in fact, it's notably one of the few Roman or antique bronzes that was never lost and rediscovered. Actually, people always sort of knew where it was, which is kind of interesting. And so our sculptor, contestant number one, must have known this through drawings or engravings of some sort. And this referencing of antique statuary is very significant. Showing off knowledge of the classics was an attempt for sculptor number one to elevate himself into the realm of the masters of the past, also the recent past, people like Andrea Pisano and Niccolo Pisano, who also had referenced antiquity in their work. So classical references like this would have been recognized and appreciated by the more educated nobles and artists serving on the judging committee. See a full view again. There we go. So classical elements would have been every bit as important as the charming naturalism of the ram scratching his ear, or the donkey drinking from the stream with the water dripping from his mouth, or the very well perspected architecture even of the altar on which Isaac kneels. So it's not just a collection of good details, though. It also works as a very cohesive whole. In this single image, we see the entirety of the story: the terror of the son, the determination and violence of the father, and the salvation of God in the form of the angel, all performing all their roles simultaneously. Pretty good, right? Then we have competitor number two. So let's move on to that. Now, at first glance, we likewise find a high level of pictorial complexity, richness of detail, and the central characters are in very similar positions. Abraham with his knife raised, Isaac kneeling on the altar. It's a little bit off to one side rather than center, but it's also a little bit larger in scale than what we saw in the last panel. And the angel, however, is not grabbing Abraham's arm to stop him, but actually is above the group, either about to grab Abraham or simply making a gesture of stop. And the ram, the donkey, the shepherds are all there, but in a very, very different arrangement from competitor number one. Instead of displaying the shepherds and the donkey on the bottom third of the panel, like the first competitor does, they're occupying actually much less space, and they're off to the left. And the reason they take up less room is because they're superimposed one on top of the other, right? One shepherd behind the donkey, one shepherd in front. And this overlap means they just take up less space. Physically separating that group of the shepherds and the donkey from Abraham and Isaac, we've got this sort of, standard, strange rock formation. And on top of that, we find the ram up at the top here. He's kneeling, his horns are caught in the thorn bush, as the passage from the Bible indicates. As for the pose and action of Abraham, it's not as aggressive as we find in the first panel, although the look of determination on this figure's face and the pose of the figure, caught just before the thrust of the knife, imparts an emotional level largely absent in the first. And physically, the most notable figure in the entire panel, of course, is Isaac, whose well-muscled torso could only have been a direct precedent from the antique, right? This is an ideal torso. This is an ideal nude. And so here we see this sculptor showing off his erudition of the antique as well. And the Isaac in the first panel, if you remember, he's scrawny, kind of withered, pretty Gothic, even to the point of being almost sort of Romanesque in his withered sort of state. But apart from this tour de force torso and maybe a little bit more of a dramatic sophistication in the Isaac, there doesn't seem to be, I'm sorry, in the Abraham, there doesn't seem to be much to distinguish this panel as the better work. However, it's only when we get past the initial first impression of both works that the mastery in the second panel comes to the fore. The virtue in the second panel isn't style, but substance. To begin with, the composition has a clarity and a unity that's lacking in the first. Confining the shepherds and the donkey to the smaller section of the panel, there's more of a sense of interval and pictorial space between the figures. And it gives the main group of Abraham and Isaac a little bit of room to breathe and it draws the eye a little bit more easily to this larger, slightly off-center group with less distraction than in the other panel. In the other panel, Abraham and Isaac have to compete for attention among, all these things going on, the full size, view of a donkey in profile, these two figures doing interesting things down there. Abraham and Isaac don't naturally appear to be center stage in this. It's not where our attention naturally is drawn. And in the second panel, when our eyes do wander away from Abraham and Isaac to look at these shepherds, what are they doing? They're posed, turning towards one another. One is gesturing back to the scene of Abraham and Isaac. Right? They're clearly discussing the scene unfolding on the other side of the rock. They're truly part of the scene, engaged in the central action, directing the viewer towards it. And we can contrast that with the other panel, those shepherds who occupy, again, a full third of the panel, but they have nothing to do with the central action. They appear absolutely oblivious to what's going on right over their shoulder, right? Pictorially, they are unnecessary, or I should say, in the narrative sense. They're extraneous. And even the ram in this panel what is he doing? He's distractedly scratching his ear, even though he's right next to this big sort of attempted murder scene going on, right? In the second panel, even the ram is attentive to the scene at hand, just as the shepherds are. And that ram is not drawing attention needlessly. And although the first panel is full of action and vitality, absolutely, and the second maybe a little bit less sort of vital. It's the second panel, it makes up for it by providing emotional, dramatic tension. The angel coming down, right? Will the angel arrive in time to stay the hand of Abraham? In the first panel, it's already done. It's a fait accompli, right? There's action, but it's a resolved action. In the second panel, the consummation of the angel's intercession is eternally pending. Right? And that charges the scene with a little bit of tension. So along with this compositional unity, there's also a sense of depth and atmosphere to the relief on our right, relief number 2. And this sense of atmosphere is clearly lacking in the first panel. Basically, in the first panel, we see each element of the composition standing out very cleanly and very clearly from the background. We've got the angel, the ram, the mountain formation. They all appear as sort of cutouts pasted onto a background, and that is because they are. So when sculptor number 1 made his relief, he cast in bronze all these little separate elements, the angel, the ram, Abraham and Isaac, and then bolted them to a flat plate of bronze, right? So this relief is made up of about a half a dozen different pieces, all sort of bolted together. Now look at the second panel, and that panel is cast in just 2 pieces. Only the figure of Isaac has been cast separately and then attached, and everything else was cast in a single piece. And because of this, there's no or less of a sense of sort of cut out elements. The sculptor is able to render the mountain just sort of blending off into nothingness behind Abraham, seamlessly merging with the background as though it were receding into the distance. Note how the angel is entering the scene from a distant background. The angel's foreshortened as though it's coming out towards the viewer, but still fairly far away. And the other angel in panel number 1, by contrast, looks like they're just sort of entering stage right, on the same pictorial plane as everything else in the scene. Right? The background plane in this first panel is simply that. It's a background plane. It's a wall. In the second panel, it's atmosphere. Now, adding to the sense of atmosphere is also just a beautifully soft treatment of the material, of the surfaces generally. Rock formations sort of melt into each other. Everything is modeled explicitly to catch or reflect light, to indicate depth and space across the surfaces. And when you sort of look at it in that sense and just how light flows over the form, the first panel's modeling seems a little bit harsh and schematic in comparison. But it's still great. They're both great. So at the end of the day, they're both great. And it's no wonder that it took the competition committee so long to figure out who to choose. And whether you prefer panel number 1 or panel number 2 really comes down to what you personally value in sculpture, what sort of turns your crank about it, right? There's just so much to like in both. So we can completely understand why this competition was a real competition. And now it is time to reveal the winning panel. Should we do a vote? It's kind of dark in here, but who's for, and there are no wrong answers. They both absolutely win in my book. Who's for panel number 1? Raise your hand. I think I'm speaking to a knowledgeable and therefore biased audience tonight. Who's for panel number 2? Everyone, because everyone likes to back a winner. Remember that next Tuesday. So yes, the panel done by Lorenzo Ghiberti, as most of you know, is the second panel, the panel on our right. Contestant number 2, take a bow, Lorenzo. Did a great job. But what was the element that really tipped the balance in Ghiberti's favor? We talked about so many things of these panels, so much going for both of them. We can't say for sure, and I'm sure everyone had their own reason, but an aspect of the craftsmanship that most certainly would have helped Ghiberti is his definite superiority in casting and bronze working. I mentioned the delicate surfaces that Ghiberti produced, and that it's cast in basically just 2 pieces. The whole thing is a single piece. One little piece bolts it on. Well, when you're able to cast something like that all in one piece, you can make it much more uniformly thin than in Brunelleschi's method of casting everything separately and having to use extra hardware to attach everything. And so there's a lot of bronze that is in the panel, but invisible because it's supporting pieces of bronze, right? And so it's just going to take up a lot more bronze. Ghiberti's casting also seems as though it came out pretty perfectly, which is a testament to fine craftsmanship. While on the back panel, just on a simple plate panel of Ghiberti, if you can see sort of behind Abraham, around the level of his thigh, there's a gap in the bronze plate. There is another, I don't know if that was intentionally made, that hole at the top to hang it at some point, probably, but there are a couple other gaps where these are basically when you're pouring bronze into a mold, sometimes gases and vapors get trapped for just a few seconds before it can escape, and that's just enough time for the bronze to freeze around that area, leaving a gap. You can also have cracks, all sorts of different things that can go wrong, and a few things did go wrong in this panel. And so overall, Ghiberti just had a superior technique. And so apart from the possibility, that the separate forms of Ghiberti's panel could, or I'm sorry, Brunelleschi's panel, if they're all bolted on, maybe one of those panels can be pried off, and maybe this door will lose things, elements of it over time. The entire, apart from that, Ghiberti's work was just much heavier than Brunelleschi's work was much heavier than Ghiberti's work. Brunelleschi's weighed 76 Florentine pounds, and Ghiberti's weighed just 55. That meant Brunelleschi's doors, where they made, extrapolating for the extra weight, would have weighed 600 pounds more than Ghiberti's proposed doors. And that's a lot of extra bronze, which is a lot of extra money. And of course, aesthetics were far from the only considerations of the Arte di Calamala. So that's probably what tipped the balance. Now, in the end, the competition for the baptistry doors was hugely significant for the lives of both of these fantastic artists. We can't feel too sorry for Brunelleschi, though he himself was absolutely gutted at the time, and he sort of immediately left Florence to go to Rome for an extended stay. But if Brunelleschi hadn't done that, if Brunelleschi had won the competition, he never would have, well, he would have stayed in Florence, certainly, to complete the doors, and likely never would have spent so much time in Rome studying architecture. And had he not done that, he might never have come up with the breathtaking, miraculous cupola gracing the top of the Duomo. Now, at some point, the Arte di Calamala actually changed the theme of the doors from the Old Testament to the life of Christ. And that's why Ghiberti's winning panel can be found in the Bargello Museum and not on the baptistry doors themselves. And again, one of the happier accidents of art history, I think, in the early Renaissance is that Filippo Brunelleschi's competition panel was not recycled for the doors and survives to this day, hanging in the Bargello right next to Ghiberti's panel. So this comparison that we've made tonight on PowerPoint can be made in the flesh at the Bargello. Now, as for Ghiberti, of course, he spent the next 21 years creating the bronze doors for the baptistry. And when they were finished, they were not mounted on the east portal of the baptistry facing the Duomo, but on the north portal of the baptistry. And that is because Ghiberti, known by then as the greatest goldsmith alive, was commissioned for the third and final set of doors and given leave to unleash all his creativity and artistic power in whatever form he chose. And when you trust an artist to do their best, you're often rewarded with a masterpiece. And this masterpiece took him 27 years. The astounding gilt bronze doors of the east portal, known to us today as the Gates of Paradise. But that is a story for a different time. And I thank you very much, and very, very happy to take questions from the audience, comments. Thank you very much.
Jason, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Captivating talk. One of my favorite moments in the history of art here in Florence. We have some time for questions before we invite those of you here in the room for a glass of wine. I'll try to mediate between any questions that might pop up also from those of you on Zoom here in the chat. Before I do, a friendly reminder for those of you joining us remotely, although you're not able to join us in person, we hope to see you one day soon here in Florence, and your donations online are always welcome. Any questions from the room, please?
Thank you. That was absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.
One thing, having seen them at the Bargello, is the different reliefs on the altars. Is there any significance about what they actually did, what the reliefs on the altars there?
Let me look. Is that possible, Jeremy?
I don't know what your power.
Yeah. Obviously, I don't know the answer to that. I've actually never considered the actual relief. Can you describe them for us?
No, one is a little bit more elaborate than the other one. I just wondered if there was any meaning to that. But...
I wouldn't subscribe meaning or significance to it. It was probably just an aesthetic sort of choice, little flourish.
Showing off.
And again, this is me postulating. I've never given it, but I've also never encountered anyone, writing, like Richard Krauthammer or any people who really, go deep onto these things. I'm not aware. Jeremy, you? Any idea? No. Any other unanswerable questions? Gosh darn it.
Other questions? Easy questions.
Easy question.
You've made a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
It's very interesting, the contribution of the guild. Is there any documentation to say what they actually asked for? And if you look at you said that it's given a free hand eventually for these stores.
For the third set, yes.
For the third set.
Yeah.
Is there a sort of stylistic difference which allows you to say freehand, more told what to do?
Certainly, certainly. So the third set of doors, of course, doesn't match the first two sets at all. The first two sets have 28 panels each in quatrefoil frames, and the Gates of Paradise have simply 10 panels because he wanted to make sort of the playing field of the pictorial space as large as possible. And so the frames are very thin. It's absolutely distinct from the other two doors. And so it kind of works that they're on the north and south side because they resemble each other very much. And now he was absolutely given, I mean, I shouldn't say absolutely, I'm sure, but he was certainly trusted to do a fantastic job, and he did. But yes, he was left more or less to his own devices to devise the general composition. Of course, he was given the theme, which is the Book of Genesis, or the Book of the Book of Genesis. Yeah.
All right, let's see if we have anyone online that would like to ask a question by unmuting their microphone and speaking to us here in Florence. Silence.
Next time.
Chickens. No, I talked them into a stupor.
They're all asleep. Any other questions here
I
in the
think I
room?
saw, yeah.
Where in Florence was the foundry?
It was actually really close to the am I getting this right, Jeremy? Is right in Piazza Duomo.
Yeah, just behind.
Yeah.
What is today the cathedral?
Yeah. So of course, nothing of it exists.
We have another question here in the audience.
Jason, can you talk a little bit more about the process? In other words, just how was this actually done?
Yeah, so in a lot of pieces is probably the first thing to point out. The reason you do it in a lot of pieces is if it's just easier to work with something as heavy as casting, hot metal if you're dealing with small quantities. Also, the risk of something going wrong is great. And so if you divide your work up into many small parts, if something happens, it only happens to a single small part. It's not all or nothing. So that's the big thing. Most of the modeling would have been finished so the first set of doors took 21 years. Probably all the modeling was finished. Certainly all the modeling was finished well within the first decade, right? And so the rest of the time would have been spent in casting, chasing, which is sort of refinishing the surface. The surface would have been absolutely entirely reworked, every part of it, sanded, filed, chiseled, textured. And so when you get up close to these things, especially on the Gates of Paradise, you see all sorts of wonderful things, little sort of incised flowers or little dudes this big wearing chainmail, and you can see the links of chainmail. Well, it wasn't cast like that. Those little links of chainmail would have been stamped in one at a time with a specially shaped little chisel, and you just sort of, stamp in different shapes, textures, and all sorts of flaws would have been needed to have been corrected. And so it's a lot of it's more cleanup than creation, really. The panels would have been modeled in wax rather than clay, and they would have been modeled onto a surface that would have served as sort of one side of the eventual mold, right? And a mold is a negative, and so you got your wax, you got mold on the backside, then you cover it with the mold material, heat it up so that wax melts out of this mold, and then you pour the bronze into that mold, so it takes the place. Nowadays, and actually very soon after the 15th century, people would make a mold and then cast a wax. And that way, if something went wrong with it, you could then cast another wax, right? The way that Ghiberti was working also for things like his St. John the Baptist or San Michele, it was one and done. He was modeling it in wax, then making the mold and burning that out. So if something went wrong, he'd have to start from scratch, which is yet another reason to take it slow and do it in small pieces.
And if anyone is doubtful of Jason's expertise in the art of bronze casting, you can admire one of his works here on display in the Sala Ferragamo by the window, a beautiful figurine of St. John the Baptist, which is the patron saint of Florence, of course, and also the protector of our cultural work here at the Institute. I think we have time for one more question here in the back, and then we'd like to invite you for a glass of wine to speak amongst yourselves and also with Jason.
Thanks, Jason.
Hey, Ellie.
Hi. I sit to the back. That was amazing. I think it just might be more the subject of your next talk, but with regards to the following commission of the Gates of Paradise, do you know if there was another competition? It's just interesting that those gates were originally supposed to be east facing, and they moved them to become north facing. Was there another competition, or they just were like, that's the probationary period, let's do the main
Yeah, the probationary period of 21 years. You know, he was awarded the commission before he was before the second set was even installed. There was just no other, you know, no one would come close. You know, he had the largest foundry workshop in Florence at the time. You know, again, he was in his early 20s when he got the first commission. First thing he did was you know, ask for enough money to build a studio and a foundry, which he did, and he employed like every artist of the first half of the 15th century in Florence. I mean, at various times you've got, you know, boy, I mean, everybody. Luca della Robbia, Brunelleschi, Nanni de Banco, Donatello, young Paulo Uccello was sweeping the floors as a 10-year-old boy. I mean, it was a who's who in that place, and you know, he was very open and you know, encouraged you know, sort of artists talking and working and collaborating with each other, and so he was just absolutely preeminent. You know, normally when we think about the early Renaissance, we think of Donatello as this huge, you know, who could be better than Donatello? But you know, for the first 30-40 years, it was Ghiberti. It was Ghiberti. Yeah, there was no other choice, really.
I see a hand raised virtually online by our dear friend Barbara Hollowell. Barbara, you might have a question or a comment for Jason, please. Barbara, just unmute your microphone and we should be able to hear you.
It won't. There we go. Okay, the host would not let me. Thank you for the very enjoyable talk, and I buy into your rationale and all your points. One point that struck me immediately when we began the who's who with panel one, I don't believe you mentioned, which was the shape that they were given. It seemed like panel one beautifully harmonized with the curves and the shape, and that panel two ignored it. It didn't seem to have anything to do really with placement. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, you're talking
the quadrille, yes.
The quatrefoil. Yeah, you're right.
Yes.
You're right. Well, I think I would say that Ghiberti more completely fills the quatrefoil, and that might have just been an exuberance of, you know, trying to show as much as he could of his skills and of his talent. Yeah, you're right. I mean, Ghiberti doesn't utilize or even address the idea of framing. You know, you've got the Abraham and Isaac a little bit off center in Ghiberti's work, whereas in Brunelleschi's it's pretty much dead center. You're right. He didn't use it as much as Ghiberti did, or as Brunelleschi did. And whether or not you think that's a tick against Ghiberti, that's the thing about composition generally, that there are no rules. If it looks good, it is good. It's kind of like, jazz in that way. If it sounds, or good music, if it sounds good, then it is good. Same thing with composition. So I think they both.
Okay, well,
yeah.
Well, thank you. You're right quote was good enough for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Barbara. And my command bar here was disappearing. I now see a message here in the chat from Lydia Morgan, who asks, technically, how did they distinguish between the color of the figures and the color of the rocks?
Well, that's simply gilding. So the shinier, yellower stuff is going to be gilt, and yeah, they chose to not gild certain aspects so that you get a little bit of contrast. There's a little bit of drapery laying below the altar in Ghiberti's that is gilt, but it's laying on rocks that aren't gilt, and that's basically the only way you can even tell that it's there. So yeah, it's gilding. It's judicious gilding.
And that's the application of gold leaf to the surface.
Yes, exactly. Application of gold leaf to the surface, which can get rubbed off quite easily. So it's not always there.
Something that we see on many bronze doors in Italy today, right? Where we have traditions to rub people for good luck and then they
Mhm.
kind of disappear after a
Yeah,
while.
whores, noses, and that sort of thing.
Well, thank you, Jason. This was an absolutely wonderful talk. And thank you for all of you.
Thank you, everyone.
It's our pleasure now to welcome you for a glass of wine. And once again, thank you, Susan, for sponsoring the talk this evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this one. It's another great